So the second session then, nature. Now of course there will be some overlap here, so I will try to give a briefer overview of the subject. As someone with a background in rural skills, who studied ecological science, someone who's drawn, painted natural scenes, other animals, someone who's written about earth-centered sacrality, this was a subject that was very layered, very complicated for me. I was excited but also apprehensive about this particular session, but I will perhaps get on to some of those misgivings or complexities rather a bit later on. Many experiences of enchantment involve other natural beings, not only animals and plants of all kinds but living places. This sense of living here overlaps with but is not limited to its biological definition, and animism is introduced as a way to remain open to and honour the former broader sense. We will also explore the possibility that all experiences of enchantment are natural, and therefore of nature. So when Patrick was talking about experiences of nature towards other animals, he gives the account by Richard Mabey, the naturalist who wrote about his encounter with a nightingale. He said that the bird was in my head, and it was me that was singing. Again, it's fundamentally relational, and metaphoricity is the key here. He is the bird, but he is also himself. Differences are not dissolved. They remain important, but they are slightly weakened. And again, it's about the subjectivity and agency within other beings. And I would just like to say here that it's not necessarily Patrick, but I have noticed that there is a general sense among eco-philosophers and people who are in green studies that they tend to denigrate science a little bit. I feel like even talking about this kind of gives the argument credence in a way, but I will hazard it nonetheless. Even though I studied ecological science, I would always maintain that I valued animals for their own intrinsic worth, and I always was moved and even sometimes was deeply emotional with encounters of other animals. The rational mastery of nature is a problem, but I would say that no one that I studied with, no one that I practiced ecology with, ever denigrated nature or thought that these beings were just numbers. Certainly not. There's a lot to be said for the way that we understand relations, and ecology can help us do this, of course. But there is a tendency sometimes to kind of promote an aggressive reductionism, to see things in purely mechanistic terms, to see other animals as being driven solely by instinct, as if they were robots, as if they were machines. Now, it should be quite obvious that to be a machine, to say that something is a machine, is itself to engage in metaphor. So to think of an animal's call, a bird call, or anything that an animal does, a bower bird building its bower, its nest, any animal that engages in particular life strategy, behaviour, it's not fundamentally a matter of instinct, a product of behavioural ecology. It's not purely about competition and fitness. As I studied all these things, but as I learned and as I've kind of always known, and I would argue that a lot of ecologists know this, but still the point should be made that an animal, a non-human animal, is its own person that is engaging in the world in its own particular way. When a bird sings, it's not just because it's trying to attract a mate or defend its territory. It's natural, but also cultural. It's gratuitous in the sense that the bird is singing for its own sake. It's useless. And how dare we say to the bird, I can hear music, but the bird itself is deaf to music. It's deaf to the other calls around it. It doesn't know what it's producing. A very flawed way of thinking, I think, to suggest that only humans can appreciate beauty. Say for example, a squirrel. A squirrel doesn't just see a tree as a resource for acorns. It's who knows what it thinks. But to limit its own participation in the world is fundamentally misguided. Something I will just point out as well is that there's of course the argument to be made for charismatic fauna. Curry talks about this. He suggests that certain non-human animals are more enchanting than others. I do agree with this up to a point, but I kind of struggle with it in that rational sense, that all animals, all non-human beings should in a sense be enchanting. But enchantment isn't democratic. I think that's something that Curry says in one of his books. It's not democratic. Again, it's not universal, to take that previous discussion about the stone and animism. And so we might be more drawn to a tiger or a bear or even a dolphin or the charismatic fauna that we typically associate with wonder. I would suggest that we could also be enchanted by a sylphid beetle, which is of course the species that I studied for my bachelor's dissertation. The carrion beetle. Not something that's typically associated with wonder, but again, I tend to think that all beings can in some way be enchanting. Just in the same way that, as Curry talks about enchantment, a variety of different aspects, enchantment anything can be enchanting. You might find a painting enchanting that I don't find enchanting, and we will discuss this later on. So moving on to experiences of place. Tolkien said that fairy, which was his word for enchantment, that fairy is the place that we inhabit when we are enchanted. Fairy includes dragons and fairies and orcs and trolls, mythical beings, fantastical beings, but it also contains bread and wine and stone and tree. It is the place where things truly matter, where we find ourselves to be in a narrative, in a song. An enchantment, the etymology of enchantment is enchantement, to be in a song. It comes from the French. That is fundamentally the root of enchantment. We are drawn into a narrative, a song. Time slows down. That's how we feel when we are in fairy. And fairy, as I wrote about in my thesis, is also, it corresponds to, it points towards the more than human world, other agencies. It's enriching but also perilous as well. Fairy is the other world, the other side, you could say. It's not the solely human-controlled anthropocentric world. And again, bringing it back to animism, as Graham Harvey says, animists are people who recognise that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship to others. This extends, this of course happens with animals, but it also happens with places, rooted places in which we find meaning and orientation. And in relation to place, something that I've found very important, and I have talked about this in the past, so I will be brief about this, the differences between mythos and logos. Mythos and logos are Greek terms. Mythos corresponds to moment and place, whereas logos responds to time and space. When we are enchanted, we are not in abstract universal time and space. We are in moment and place. We are in a particular location, given a particular set of meanings, and we inhabit a place, we inform it, but it also informs us. And mythos and logos is a concept that I find myself more and more drawn towards, especially in relation to my own writings. And I find this has a lot to recommend it to the studies of Byung-Chul Han, the loss of meaning in the world, a poverty in world. And so I was very much affirmed in my own thinking, and it kind of touched on a lot of deep topics for me this session. I talked about issues with nature, my own perception of ecology and science, and I also had the chance to ask about questions of identity politics, and critical social justice as well, which I view in some ways to be harming our relationship with the natural world. Earlier, you were speaking about liminal places, and I was kind of surprised to hear you suggest that places like airports and hotels might hold a kind of potential for enchantment, because these places would seem to me to be places or non-places. They're very transitory. They're not rooted in a sense of place. We we go there for no other purpose than to move to another place. They're not rooted. They're not filled with story in a sense.
Mm.
So 'cause I've always thought like a place like an airport or a train station is transitory. It's disenchanting in a way,
Mhm.
especially with the modern urban center. These are not places rooted in heritage and things like this.
Yeah.
So I was a little bit surprised. Obviously, I understand what you mean by liminality being conducive to enchantment, but places like hotels, I don't see them as being enchanting. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, obviously, I know what you're talking about,
Mm,
and airports, shopping centers, and some hotels, chains of hotels, are as close to non-places as they can possibly
mm,
be. Uh, they are deliberately designed to be, as it were, interchangeable with each other. That which is sort of almost the definition of a non-place,
mm,
and yet they can't even there. They cannot eliminate the possibility of an unscripted encounter or unplanned developments or thoughts occurring, or you know have you not been on a, let's say, on a plane or on a train or whatever, and notice that you have a certain, sometimes you have a certain freedom to sit and
mm,
think about something in a way in which your thoughts are not constrained by your normal environment. There's a certain kind of weird freedom there in that, just because they are liminal places, even
mm,
though they're not very nice liminal places. I quite agree. They're not richly liminal.
mm,
But what interests me is that they're skeletally liminal. In other words, you can't, even they would love to get rid of the liminality so that everything
sure.
about that environment was predictable and controllable and could be maximized for profit. They'd love to do that, but they can't, because they can't finally get rid of that liminality. So, I mean, Hermes just cannot be pinned down. And that's why I describe them not as being necessarily fully blown liminal places, but residually liminal or irreducibly liminal in the end. Does that make sense?
It doesn't make sense. It's a very good point, I think. Because I believe you've in the past you've talked about riparian places, ponds and rivers and so forth.
Oh,
These are
yes.
liminal in a
Oh, yeah.
sense. Yes,
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
they
Yeah.
have a similar quality, but I would still consider those places to be more rooted in a sense, but
More
more
robust.
robust. Mm, mm,
Absolutely. Yeah.
mm,
Yeah. But I'm glad you mentioned riparian, because, the, the margins where one kind of natural environment meets another. So where the water meets the land, and those, and even underwater where the sand meets the seaweed coming up or whatever, they're even in terms of biodiversity
mm,
unusually rich.
indeed.
because in a sense they're biologically liminal. So this concept has a lot of mileage in it.
I would just say, I'll just very quickly say that you're definitely right when it comes to the biodiversity benefits, I suppose, of edge places. You
That's right.
obviously know that I'm an ecologist, and
Yeah,
woodland edges are fantastic for biodiversity. So,
yeah, yeah,
transitory places, liminal places are good for that as well.
yeah,
But
yeah.
yes, thank you for answering the question.
Absolutely.
So, Patrick, obviously, listening to all the stories that you've told us this evening about enchantment, I feel like I need to mention something that's been rather frustrating for me. I think for you as well, if I read your articles correctly. And this is very broad, so feel free to say that you can't answer it today. I've noticed that even though non-anthropocentrism has become common parlance in the discourse for environmental studies and for the humanities as well,
Hmm.
it's still very much rooted in our thinking, of course.
Hmm.
Ecosystem services, postmodern, post-nature theorizing, which you'll be aware of, critical social justice as well. And the latter one I find particularly worrying because it's really we're not looking toward the other. We seem to be drawing more and more inward, despite the fact that we seem to be cultivating a wonder for nature. We're actually going inward constantly, being obsessed with immutable characteristics and labels. Now, I might be a bit fiery headed in this and looking too much into it, but the whole notion of identity politics and all these surrounding topics, I find
Well, it
backwards and
is
quite
deeply
regressive.
anthropocentric.
It
I
is, it
agree with
is, it is. And it's for me, it seems to, I've just written here that it seems to be a merging of the worst tendencies of religious thinking, but also scientific secular mastery as well. In that,
you.
as you say in one of your articles, that we're engaging in impassioned quasi-theological debates. I think
Mm.
that's one of the things that you said in your poverty of identity article,
Mm.
poverty of identity politics article.
Mm.
And but on the scientific side, we're also reducing and dissecting ourselves constantly like specimens.
Mm.
So the human figure, it's almost like a soured humanism. We're so solipsistically and narcissistically involved with ourselves with identity politics that we are. How can we experience moments of enchantment when all we seem to care about is our
Yeah, I can
yeah.
I think you can't close the door on enchantment. It can still happen, but it's much less likely to happen. And with the loss of that, you lose what you might have learned about an other, a genuine other. I think the identity politics thing is very anthropocentric, that is, say, human orientated, and tends to shut out awareness of non-human others and non-human agency and subjectivity. But obviously, it can't be banned. I mean, that wouldn't even be a good thing.
Mm,
What you need
mm,
to do, perhaps, is encourage contextualizing identity politics. Say, yes, they're important in their own way,
mm.
and there's some genuine concerns here about social justice and so on.
Sure, sure.
But the larger context is that the entire, what do they say? There's no social justice on a dead planet.
Mm,
Even
mm,
that's a bit instrumental.
mm.
What are the ethics of the fact that since 1970, three-quarters of wild animals have been killed? You know, is there no ethical issue here, really? And keep on bringing uh, that kind of point to bear on solely human concerns, such that it becomes obvious that solely human concerns are not the only ones that matter.
Certainly, certainly. Mm,
Yeah, that's.
yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I like what somebody said to me the other day. She said, "Everything's getting better, and everything's getting worse." So, so
It's
let's not get too caught up in it's all going one way or it's all going this. It,
sure, sure.
it's
Mm.
all in play. Yeah.
Thanks. Since this is my area of interest in particular, I did have a slightly longer question. I'll try to summarize if that's all right.
Sure.
Sure, thanks. So I just wanted to, I'll lay out some things first because for me this is quite a important topic, and I just want to get everything clarified. So as Patrick will know, I have a background in the humanities. a background in the ecological science and countryside management, and I eventually moved towards the humanities. However, I've been somewhat frustrated because it seems to me that a lot of people in the area of wonder enchantment and in eco philosophy in particular, they can see science as being somewhat harmful. They can actually misinterpret the management aspect. I just want to clarify that
Mhm.
I've never really seen science as being, sorry, I've never really seen nature as being inert and mechanistic, or
Mhm.
I've certainly never seen ecological science as being for the benefit of humanity and wanting to control nature. I think that management is actually kind of a misnomer. I
Mhm.
studied countryside management, but I wouldn't say that anyone that I studied with was a heartless manager, for example. Our job was to increase structural diversity and biodiversity, to control the spread of non-natives, and also to facilitate countryside access.
Mhm.
And I'm getting to the end shortly, but
That's all right.
my this actually brings me back to something that I quickly mentioned in the last session, which is about quantification. I've been thinking a lot about this in the past week, and my main concern about ecological science is quantification. It's necessary to survey species and to categorize habitats, but even if I always found intrinsic value, always, in species and other animals, I noticed that over the years, studying ecology, wildlife ecology, I tended to find that I would just see a particular bird, for example, as not as a person, even though I wanted to think that. I tended to see this bird as an example of a species. So
Right.
the long-tailed tit, for example, just as an example, not as an individual person.
Mhm.
And I might characterize woodlands as a particular type of woodland based on its physiognomy or whatever it might be.
Mhm.
But I've noticed, and I'm getting to the end here, I've noticed that I was reading Hayden Washington's book, A Sense of Wonder Toward Nature, and I know Patrick is was a good friend of Hayden Washington, and I can see why. Hayden said that he sees the value he sees the value in seeing nature as sacred, but he also says, like me, he says he believes that rational science is also important to finding solutions to many of our environmental problems. So just an observation,
Sure.
it's it's a third path, it's a third way, a third road, a kind of blending between the two, which is
Right.
which I find valuable. So we need to value the sacredness of the earth, of course,
Right.
and we also need to value rational science, as it's called, obviously, to make to implement these solutions.
Mhm.
So just an observation. It's interesting that it's a third path, and I know that Curry, you talk about third path quite a lot. So I just wanted to share that observation. I know that's quite a layered and kind of complicated thing to mention at the start, but thanks for listening.
Tell me why do you think this is an open question, it's not a loaded question.
Sure, sure.
Why do you think you saw in those circumstances the long-tailed tit or whatever it was not as an individual but as an instance of a species, say, or whatever? What led to that happening, do you think?
I s- it's a tricky thing because I still when I would see so let's say I've seen a long-tailed tit just appearing in front of me. I would still tend to value the agency of this other person, but I was molded in a way to because I was studying taxonomy and phylogeny and things
Uh,
like this. It's
mm,
too much rank and order and hierarchy, whereas it's actually just an individual with its own life and its own qualities
mm, mm.
as opposed to just an example of Turdus marula or Aegyphalus caudatus or something like this,
Yeah,
different bird species. So even I always, obviously, I would like to think I always valued the intrinsic value of nature, but I've noticed that studying ecology for that length of time, it did actually change my perception.
sure.
But I will just to clarify, I will always maintain that our job was to improve biodiversity, and we weren't heartless managers or anything like that. We
No,
weren't
sure.
quantifying and things. So Thanks for listening to that extended diatribe.
Yeah, no. Um, I think it's quite a complex question.
Mm.
Not your question. I mean the whole question about
Yes, yeah, yeah,
science.
yeah,
And I persist in believing that what I want to call real scientists understand the agency, appreciate the agency of
mm.
the natural world, um, and um, and also, of course, that they're not heartless. I think
Sure.
that, however, in the considering science as a whole, particularly as a kind of as a social formation with and with a political dimension to it,
So,
and it's it's involved in various power relations, collective ones, that it is subject to considerable pressure
mm, mm.
to become heartless in certain situations.
Certainly. Yeah.
And to produce results that can be used by people uh, who are themselves relatively heartless. Um, and that makes it actually what one effect is that makes science a sort of frontline area of struggle
Mm-hmm.
when you have actual results which don't tell the power people what they want to hear.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
Then they tend to shut down the funding, or they tend to just ignore the results, et cetera, et cetera.
Sure.
Um, this has been happening in America for years now, and it also happens, for example, in relation to wolves in Northern Europe.
Mm.
Uh, Governments have a constituency of livestock farmers to keep happy. They don't want to
Yep.
know that, say, wolves actually
Mm.
kill extraordinarily few
Mm-hmm.
animals in such circumstances and so on.
Indeed.
So I think it's a very much contested area, which has
Certainly.
room for. Also, another thing is science has room for enchantment for the enchantment of nature on the part of individual scientists. Absolutely,
Mm-hmm.
no doubt about that. But at the same time, they come under considerable pressure to eliminate any such experiences or any such discourse which would be condemned as subjective, not
Sure.
or worse, sentimental. That's like a hanging offense in this context. When they write up and report the results,
Mm-hmm.
particularly in academic and scientific papers, um, for example, the elements that led to let's say, a scientific discovery are minimized and the elements justifying the discovery are maximized. So the impression given is anybody in the right set of circumstances could have discovered this.
Mm-hmm.
But as a
Yep.
matter of fact, it wasn't anybody who discovered it. It was the person who did discover it. And that person must bring a unique element into the equation, and they don't like the unique element at all because it can't be controlled. It can't be controlled for.
Certainly.
In a sense, it can't be meta managed.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very contested.
Thanks. Yes, the last point on that, I think the distinction to be made, at least from in my head anyway, is a distinction between people that are just trying to work in with the land, trying
Yeah,
to increase diversity,
yeah,
and then the whole other side, the larger side with natural capital and ecosystem services and things that can be capitalized on, measured, and turning woodlands into so much timber, as I think you've once said,
yeah,
the large scale uh, methods of governance and things like this. But
yeah.
yes,
I would say anytime you hear the word services, as in
hmm
ecosystem services, an alarm bell, a big alarm bell should go off.
it does for me now. It does certainly.
Because it's talking about really in a sense enslaving the natural world
Hmm.
for our benefit alone, as if we were the only species or the only one that mattered. And
Hmm.
in practice, it's for the benefit of a few of us, not all of us. And the other word that should ring alarm bells is resources,
Exactly. Exactly.
because that
Yeah.
immediately reduces living nature with agency and subjectivity
Hmm.
to something that's essentially inert, as you know,
Hmm.
and there is there to be used. And since it's inert, you don't need to consider ethics because
I think
there's no relationship happening.
certainly.
It's just a thing, an object, so you can use it for anything you want.
Well, the very last point I will make, because I've always wanted to talk to Patrick about this. I I think the only benefit, I think the only positive argument that you can make for ecosystem services is that it's in some senses a way of getting people on board with the value of nature, because they need to see it in monetary terms. They need to see
Right.
what it can provide, and so that's one way of arguing for it. But I don't agree with
Well,
it
sometimes
overall.
it may be unavoidable, but it's a double-edged sword,
It
isn't it?
is, yeah, it
Because
is.
at a meta level, it encourages
Hmm.
the disenchantment of thinking about things instrumentally.
Indeed.
Anyway,
Yeah,
yeah.
thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.